My name is Daniel Mercer, and before everything imploded, I believed I was a man who understood the shape of his own life. I was 32 years old, a civil engineer by training and project manager by promotion, the kind of job that rewarded patience, precision, and long hours staring at plans that other people barely noticed. I had built my reputation the same way I built bridges and foundations, slowly, carefully, and with the belief that if you did things the right way, they would hold. I was average height, broad-shouldered from years of weekend gym routines I never skipped, clean-cut, dependable, and proud of the fact that chaos rarely touched me. That illusion lasted right up until the week before my wedding. Before we continue with the story, kindly support the channel by hitting the like button, share this video, and subscribe. Now new, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. Emily Hart was 29 when we got engaged, a marketing consultant with an effortless smile and the kind of warmth that made people lean in when she spoke. We met 4 years earlier at a charity networking event downtown, one of those obligatory mixers where professionals pretended to care about small talk while secretly scanning the room for escape routes. She spilled red wine on my sleeve, panicked, apologized far too much, and then laughed in a way that made me forget the stain entirely. We talked for 2 hours straight, ignoring everyone else, and by the end of the night I felt something settle into place that I didn't even know had been missing. She told me later she felt the same, like our paths had been quietly converging long before that moment. Our relationship unfolded the way I thought all good ones did, steady, intentional, and anchored in trust. We moved in together after a year, adopted a rescue dog named Milo, and learned each other's rhythms with the comfort of people who assumed they were building towards something permanent. Emily admired my discipline and my sense of responsibility. I admired her creativity and emotional intelligence, the way she could read a room and adapt without losing herself. When I proposed at 31, on a quiet overlook during a weekend trip to the coast, she cried, said yes without hesitation, and told me she couldn't wait to be my wife. We planned to marry when I was 32 and she was 30, a detail we repeated so often it felt like a milestone already achieved. My father, Richard Mercer, was a looming presence throughout my life, though not always in the way a son hopes for. He was 61 at the time, a retired sales executive who had always measured success by appearances, cars, suits, connections. He taught me how to shake a hand firmly, look people in the eye, and never let them see uncertainty. What he never taught me was how to talk about feelings, or how to admit fault without framing it as strategy. Our relationship was cordial but distant, built on obligation rather than intimacy. When I introduced Emily to him, I took comfort in how polite he was, how complimentary, how he praised my choice with the approval of a man ticking off boxes. The wedding planning phase should have been stressful in the normal ways, budgets, guest lists, seating charts, but instead it felt almost serene. Emily and I were aligned on nearly everything, from the small outdoor venue to the understated decor. I took time off work to help, surprising myself with how invested I became in details I'd once dismissed as trivial. Friends joked that I was unusually calm for a groom, but the truth was simpler. I trusted my life. I trusted the woman I was about to marry, the family who would stand beside me, and the future that seemed clearly mapped out. There was no room in my mind for doubt, because doubt had never been part of the plan. The first crack appeared quietly, the way disasters often do. Emily began acting distracted during the final weeks, checking her phone more often, stepping outside to take calls she claimed were work-related. I noticed but dismissed it, telling myself stress explained everything. When she mentioned she'd run into my father while coordinating a vendor detail, something I didn't even know he was involved in, I felt a brief, inexplicable tightening in my chest. Richard lived across town and rarely involved himself in my personal affairs, but Emily said he'd offered help, advice, connections. I laughed it off, joking that he finally had time on his hands. I didn't know then how dangerous my assumptions were. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I stayed late at the office reviewing final documents for a project that would break ground after my honeymoon. I remember feeling proud, grounded, like a man standing exactly where he was supposed to be. My phone buzzed with a message from Emily saying she was tired and turning in early. I replied with a heart emoji and told her I loved her. That exchange, ordinary and unremarkable, would later replay in my mind with a cruelty I still struggle to articulate. At that moment, I believed I was at the threshold of the best chapter of my life. I had no idea that everything I trusted was already unraveling behind my back. The morning of the rehearsal dinner arrived with a strange heaviness I couldn't quite name, the kind that sits behind your ribs and makes every breath feel slightly off. I woke early, unable to sleep, and went for a long run through my neighborhood, hoping the familiar burn in my lungs would clear my head. Instead, my thoughts kept circling back to small, insignificant moments I'd ignored: Emily's distracted smiles, the way she sometimes flinched when my father's name came up, the sudden increase in work emergencies that pulled her away at odd hours. I told myself I was overthinking things, that nerves before a wedding could twist even the most stable mind. Still, when I returned home, sweaty and restless, I checked my phone again, half expecting a message that would explain the unease. There was nothing, just silence where reassurance should have been. Later that afternoon, while picking up my suit from the tailor, I ran into my father unexpectedly. Richard stood near the front desk, impeccably dressed as always, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture confident in a way that commanded attention without effort. He smiled when he saw me, clapped a hand on my shoulder, and told me how proud he was, how lucky I was to be marrying a woman like Emily. There was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten, an emphasis that felt misplaced, almost proprietary. When I mentioned Emily was busy with last-minute details, his eyes flickered just briefly before he recovered, asking if everything was ready for the big day. I nodded, forcing a smile, and told myself I was imagining things, that old habits of mistrust toward my father were coloring a harmless interaction. The real shift came that evening, just hours before the rehearsal dinner, when I returned home early to grab some paperwork I'd forgotten. Emily wasn't supposed to be there. She'd said she was meeting a friend. As I stepped inside, I heard her voice coming from the bedroom, low and urgent, followed by a pause so long it felt deliberate. I didn't mean to listen, but something rooted me in place. Her words were fragmented, filled with emotion I hadn't heard directed at me in weeks. When she finally said, "I can't keep pretending this didn't happen," my heart began to pound so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I backed away before she noticed me, left the house without the paperwork, and drove aimlessly, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as my mind raced to assemble explanations that wouldn't destroy the life I thought I knew. By the time the rehearsal dinner began, the seed of doubt had grown into something far more dangerous. I watched Emily across the table, laughing at a joke from my cousin, her smile bright and convincing, and wondered how well I truly knew the woman sitting beside me. My father raised a toast, speaking eloquently about family, legacy, and new beginnings, his eyes lingering on Emily just a beat too long. The room applauded, glasses clinked, and I felt like the only person standing still while everything else moved forward. I smiled, played my role, and accepted congratulations, all while a quiet realization took shape inside me. Something was wrong, deeply and irrevocably wrong, and no amount of denial could push it back into the shadows. That night, as I lay awake next to Emily, listening to her breathing even out in sleep, I knew the man I'd been in Chapter 1 was already gone, replaced by someone on the brink of a truth that would demand a reckoning. I didn't confront Emily that night, or the next morning, or even during the frantic hours leading up to the wedding day. Instead, I did what I had always done when faced with uncertainty: I gathered facts. Logic had been my refuge my entire life, the place I went when emotions threatened to pull me under. While Emily showered that morning, humming softly as if the world were exactly as it should be, I sat at the edge of the bed staring at her phone, which she'd left charging on the nightstand. My hands shook as I picked it up, not because I wanted to invade her privacy, but because something inside me already knew what I was going to find. When I unlocked it, a message thread sat open, unhidden, unprotected, almost as if it wanted to be discovered. The name at the top of the screen wasn't a coworker or a friend. It was my father's. I scrolled slowly, my breath shallow, each message landing like a physical blow. There were weeks of conversations, intimate and explicit, filled with words that belonged nowhere near the life I thought I was building. They talked about stolen moments, about guilt and desire, about how complicated everything was now that the wedding was so close. One message from Emily made my vision blur, where she confessed she didn't know how to face me anymore, how every smile felt like a lie. My father's response followed quickly, telling her to stay calm, to go through with the ceremony, to trust that he would handle things afterward. In that moment, something fundamental inside me fractured. This wasn't a mistake, or a single lapse in judgment. It was a sustained betrayal, carefully hidden beneath my trust, orchestrated by the two people who were supposed to protect me the most. I sat there for a long time after the shower stopped running, my mind strangely calm despite the chaos unraveling inside my chest. Anger came later, but first there was clarity, sharp and unforgiving. I realized that if I confronted them privately, they would deny, deflect, minimize, and beg for forgiveness on their terms. My father would frame it as weakness or temptation, Emily as confusion or fear. They would ask me to be understanding, to keep things quiet, to preserve appearances. The irony of that expectation almost made me laugh. I thought about the wedding guests arriving in a few hours, about the vows we were supposed to exchange, about the future that had already been poisoned. And that was when the idea took shape, not reckless, not violent, but deliberate. If they had chosen secrecy and humiliation for me, then truth would be my response, delivered where it could no longer be buried. I deleted nothing, changed nothing, and returned the phone exactly where it had been. When Emily emerged, wrapped in a towel, smiling nervously as she asked if I was okay, I told her I was fine. The words tasted bitter, but I needed her to believe them. I needed everything to proceed exactly as planned. As she leaned down to kiss my cheek, I felt a wave of something colder than anger wash over me, resolve. The ceremony would happen, but not in the way anyone expected. By the time guests took their seats and music filled the air, I would no longer be the unsuspecting groom walking toward a lie. I would be a man reclaiming his dignity in the only place that betrayal like this deserved to be exposed. And as I put on my suit, hands steady now, I understood that the wedding wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my payback. The venue looked exactly as Emily had dreamed it would, bathed in soft afternoon light with rows of white chairs facing an arch draped in pale flowers. Guests filtered and smiling, dressed in their best, unaware they were walking into the center of a carefully controlled storm. I stood in the groom's suite adjusting my cufflinks, my reflection staring back at me with unfamiliar intensity. I looked calm, composed, every inch the man about to be married, but inside I felt hollowed out and sharpened at the same time. The evidence sat safely backed up on my phone and a flash drive in my pocket, my insurance against denial or rewriting history. I wasn't nervous about speaking in front of people, I was nervous about whether exposing the truth would finally free me or leave scars deeper than silence ever could. When the music started and I took my place at the altar, I saw Emily at the end of the aisle, radiant in her dress, escorted by her father. The sight of her still triggered a familiar ache, a reminder of the woman I thought I knew and the future I had imagined. She smiled when our eyes met, relief flickering across her face, likely believing whatever crisis she feared had passed. My father sat in the front row, posture straight, hands folded, wearing the satisfied expression of a man confident in his control over outcomes. I noticed how comfortable he looked, how at ease he was playing his role. That calm certainty hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about Emily's betrayal anymore, it was about years of unspoken power, of my father assuming he could take whatever he wanted and manage the consequences afterward. The ceremony began smoothly, the officiant's voice steady as he spoke about love, commitment, and honesty. Each word felt heavier than the last, layered with irony that made my chest tighten. When it came time for vows, Emily went first, her voice trembling with emotion as she spoke about trust, partnership, and choosing me every day. Guests dabbed at their eyes, murmurs of approval rippling through the crowd. I listened without interrupting, absorbing every word, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. She deserved to finish, just as everyone deserved to hear what came next without interruption or confusion. When the officiant turned to me and asked if I was ready to share my vows, I took a deep breath and nodded, feeling an unexpected calm settle over me. I didn't begin with prepared lines or poetic promises. Instead, I spoke plainly, my voice carrying easily in the quiet space. I told them who I was, how much I had believed in this day, and how sacred I thought the idea of marriage was. Then I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw everyone in. I said that before I could make any vows, there was something everyone needed to know, something that made it impossible for me to stand there and pretend. Confusion rippled through the guests, Emily's smile faltering as her eyes searched my face. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and connected it to the screen we'd arranged for the reception slideshow, a detail no one questioned until that moment. The messages appeared one by one, large and unmistakable, names visible, words impossible to misinterpret. Gasps filled the space as people leaned forward, reading in stunned silence. Emily froze, color draining from her face as she realized there was no escaping what she'd done. My father stood abruptly, anger and panic warring in his expression as he demanded I stop, his voice cracking through the shock. I didn't raise my voice or insult either of them. I simply stated the truth, that my fiancée and my father had been having an affair behind my back, right up until days before the wedding. I explained that this ceremony was not a union but a revelation, and that I refused to build my life on lies designed to protect people who had so thoroughly disrespected me. Security moved quickly when my father tried to approach the altar, guests parting instinctively as he was escorted out amid whispers and disbelief. Emily collapsed into a chair, sobbing, her carefully constructed image unraveling in front of everyone she cared about. I felt no triumph in that moment, only a profound sense of release, like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. I thanked the guests for coming, apologized for the shock, and told them they were free to leave or stay for refreshments if they wished. Then I stepped away from the altar, past the flowers and empty promises, knowing there was no going back, and for the first time in days, I didn't want to. I didn't linger at the venue after I stepped down from the altar, because there was nothing left for me there except echoes of what might have been. The air outside felt cooler, cleaner, like the world itself was giving me space to breathe again. I got into my car without ceremony, hands steady on the wheel, and drove away while guests were still murmuring behind me, still processing the spectacle they just witnessed. My phone buzzed repeatedly, texts, missed calls, voicemails, but I ignored them all. For the first time since discovering the truth, I wasn't reacting to anyone else's choices or emotions. I was choosing myself. That realization, simple as it sounds, felt revolutionary. I drove until the venue disappeared in my rearview mirror, until the version of my life that had included Emily and my father no longer felt like something I was abandoning, but something I was surviving. The fallout was immediate and brutal, but it wasn't mine to manage. Emily's friends reached out first, some apologetic, some defensive, a few accusing me of cruelty for exposing the affair publicly. I didn't respond. My mother called later that night, her voice shaking as she tried to reconcile the man she'd been married to for decades with the betrayal laid bare in front of everyone. That conversation was one of the hardest I've ever had, not because I felt guilt, but because I finally understood how deeply my father's selfishness rippled outward. Richard himself sent a single message, long and carefully worded, framing his actions as a mistake born of loneliness and poor judgment. I read it once, felt nothing, and deleted it. Some betrayals don't deserve debate or closure. They deserve distance. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding in practical, tangible ways. I canceled joint accounts, sold the house we'd planned to turn into a family home, and threw myself into work with a renewed sense of purpose. Colleagues who had attended the wedding avoided my eyes at first, unsure what to say, until I made it clear I didn't want sympathy or gossip. What surprised me most was how quickly my sense of self stabilized once the lies were gone. The anger burned hot for a while, but beneath it was relief that I hadn't married into deception, relief that I'd trusted my instincts before it was too late. Therapy helped me unpack the years of silent competition and emotional distance with my father, patterns I hadn't fully recognized until they exploded into the open. One evening, months later, I stood alone in my new apartment, looking out over the city lights, and felt something close to peace settle in my chest. My life didn't look the way I'd planned it to, but it was honest, and that mattered more than I'd ever understood before. I knew trust would take time to rebuild, that love wouldn't come easily or quickly again, but I wasn't afraid of that anymore. The ceremony that was meant to bind me had instead freed me, stripping away illusions and forcing me to define myself on my own terms. I wasn't the man who walked down the aisle expecting a fairy tale ending. I was the man who stopped the story when it became a lie, and that choice, painful as it was, gave me back my future. Time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges, not by erasing what happened, but by teaching you how to carry it without bleeding. A year after the wedding that wasn't, my life looked quieter on the surface, but stronger underneath. I was 33 then, a little older, a little more guarded, but far more honest with myself than I had ever been before. I had moved into a smaller place closer to work, a space that felt entirely mine rather than a compromise built around shared dreams that no longer existed. My days were structured again, early mornings, demanding projects, long walks with Milo in the evenings, but this time, that structure wasn't about control. It was about stability. I had learned the hard way that stability doesn't come from trusting the wrong people blindly, it comes from knowing your own boundaries and refusing to let anyone cross them, no matter who they are. My relationship with my family changed irrevocably, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. My parents separated quietly months after the ceremony, the weight of truth finally too heavy for my mother to carry alone. She and I grew closer in the aftermath, bonded by shared disappointment but also by resilience. We talked openly in ways we never had before, about expectations, about silence, about how often people mistake endurance for love. My father became a distant figure, someone I no longer tried to understand or forgive on a schedule dictated by others. I didn't announce a dramatic cutoff or deliver speeches about betrayal anymore, I simply chose absence. That distance wasn't fueled by rage, but by clarity. I understood now that protecting my peace didn't require justification. It required consistency, and for the first time, I gave myself permission to prioritize that without guilt. Emily faded from my life more completely than I'd expected, not because the pain vanished, but because I stopped feeding it with unanswered questions. She sent a few messages over the months, apologies layered with regret, explanations that tried to soften the reality of her choices, but I never replied. Closure, I learned, isn't something someone else hands you when they're ready. It's something you claim when you stop waiting. I didn't need to hear why she did it or how conflicted she'd felt. I already knew the only truth that mattered: she had made a decision, repeatedly, knowing it would destroy me if discovered. Accepting that freed me in ways no apology ever could. I stopped replaying the ceremony in my head, stopped imagining alternate outcomes, and let the memory settle where it belonged, in the past, as a lesson rather than a wound. What surprised me most was how hope returned, quietly and without fanfare. Not the naive hope I'd once had, built on assumptions and idealized futures, but a grounded kind rooted in self-respect. I began dating again slowly, cautiously, paying attention not just to chemistry but to character. I listened more, asked better questions, and walked away sooner when something felt off. I no longer mistook charm for integrity or familiarity for safety. The man who once believed that loyalty was guaranteed by proximity now understood that it was proven only through consistent action. And that understanding changed everything. I wasn't hardened or cynical, I was discerning, and there was a profound difference between the two. When I look back now, I don't see the ceremony as an act of revenge, even though that's how it looked from the outside. I see it as the moment I stopped sacrificing my dignity to preserve other people's comfort. I stood in front of everyone who mattered and told the truth, not to humiliate, but to refuse silence. That choice reshaped my life more than the marriage ever could have. I didn't get the wedding, the wife, or the future I planned, but I gained something far more enduring. I gained myself. And that, in the end, was the real beginning. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.